The night it all began, I remember sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the grooves in the wood, as if the answers to my life were carved there. It was late, too late for most married couples to still be awake, but I'd been waiting for Lauren to come home. Again, I'd made dinner that night. Nothing special, just spaghetti and garlic bread. But it sat untouched, the sauce congealing on the plates like my patience for her excuses. She walked in at 11:47 p.m. I know because I'd checked the clock so many times, its ticking was seared into my brain. Her heels clicked against the tile as she stepped inside, a sound that used to signal homecoming, but now felt like an accusation. She didn't apologize for being late. She didn't even look at me. "Work ran late again," she said casually, dropping her purse on the counter like we weren't already unraveling. These late nights had become her routine, a blur of board meetings and client dinners that always seemed to end somewhere far from home. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The words on the tip of my tongue were sharp, dangerous, but I swallowed them like poison. Confronting her wouldn't help. Not yet. As she slipped off her heels and reached for a glass of wine, I noticed the faint smear of lipstick on her collar. It wasn't hers. Lauren hated red lipstick. I stared at the stain, and for a moment, the world narrowed to that one small detail, that one damning piece of evidence. But she caught me looking and laughed. "What?" she said, smirking like I was the fool here. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I shook my head, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "Nothing," I lied. "Just tired." She shrugged, sipping her wine, already dismissing me like she'd done for months now. I watched her, this woman I'd built a life with, and wondered how we'd gotten here. When had the warmth between us turned into this cold, uneven silence? I wanted to ask her. I wanted to scream at her. But I didn't. Instead, I waited, because something deep in my gut told me the truth would come to me. And when it did, I needed to be ready. Lauren kissed me on the cheek before heading upstairs, her lips brushing my skin with the same disinterest she gave to strangers. I sat there long after she was gone, staring at the untouched plates and the empty wine bottle, my heart a storm of doubt and fury. I didn't know the whole story yet, but I knew enough. My wife was lying to me. And worse, she thought I was too stupid to notice. That night, as I lay awake in bed beside her, her perfume still clinging faintly to the sheets, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't confront her. I wouldn't argue or plead. I'd wait. I'd watch. And when the time was right, I'd make her regret ever thinking she could fool me. The next morning, Lauren was all smiles, humming as she made herself a smoothie, like the previous night hadn't happened. She acted as if we were the perfect couple, laughing, chatting about her plans for the day, pretending we hadn't drifted so far apart that we were practically strangers living under the same roof. I played along. I had to. I couldn't let her see the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. So I nodded at her stories, threw in the occasional laugh, and kissed her goodbye as she headed out the door in another one of her tight pencil skirts and towering heels. She looked stunning, as always. Too stunning for a regular workday. But I didn't say a word. As soon as she was gone, I went to her side of the closet. My hands trembled slightly as I sifted through the perfectly organized rows of clothes. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, lipstick stains, receipts, some cliché hallmark of infidelity, but all I found was her usual scent lingering in the air, mocking me with its familiarity. It was clean, sterile, too perfect. Then I saw it, buried under her winter coats, hidden like a dirty secret. A black leather overnight bag I'd never seen before. My heart slammed against my ribs as I pulled it out. Inside, there were toiletries, a set of silk pajamas I'd never seen her wear, and lingerie so lacy it was practically non-existent. My wife wasn't the type to pack like this for a work trip. Not for me, anyway. I stuffed everything back into the bag, careful to leave it exactly as I'd found it. My fingers itched to take pictures, to gather evidence right then and there, but I stopped myself. If I moved too quickly, I'd tip her off. No, this wasn't the time. Not yet. Instead, I installed a GPS tracker on her car. It was surprisingly easy, just a tiny device I tucked beneath the rear bumper, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. I felt a pang of guilt as I walked away, but it was drowned out by the anger simmering just beneath the surface. She'd made me doubt her. She made me do this. If she wasn't guilty, there'd be nothing to find, right? That evening, she came home late again. Not as late as the night before, but late enough to make me suspicious. She breezed into the house, carrying a to-go bag from her favorite sushi place and tossing her purse onto the counter. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She nodded, dropping into a chair and unwrapping her dinner. "Yeah, one of those days. Meetings, phone calls, putting out fires. You know how it is." I watched her, trying to gauge if she could feel my eyes on her. She didn't even look up. For someone so full of excuses, she was remarkably at ease. Too at ease. It made my blood boil, but I swallowed it down, keeping my face neutral. I stayed up late again that night, scrolling through the tracking app on my phone. It showed every stop she'd made that day. Her office, a coffee shop near downtown, and then a private home in a neighborhood I didn't recognize. She'd been there for over 2 hours before heading to the sushi place and coming home. I clicked on the address, copying it into a search engine. The name Daniel Harper popped up, a real estate agent in his early 40s, divorced, no kids. His face stared back at me from the screen, clean-cut and confident, his smile polished and practiced. The kind of man Lauren would have mocked for being too perfect. I stared at his photo for a long time, the pieces slowly clicking together in my mind. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was real. And as the realization sank in, I felt the anger inside me solidify into something cold, something sharp. I didn't know exactly how I'd handle it yet, but I knew one thing for certain. Lauren was about to learn just how dangerous it was to underestimate me. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about that address and the man attached to it. Daniel Harper. The name echoed in my mind like a taunt, daring me to confront him, to demand answers. But I wasn't ready to show my hand. Not yet. Instead, I did what any man with a grudge and a smartphone would do. I started digging. Daniel's social media was a goldmine. His profile was full of curated photos designed to showcase his perfect life. Smiling selfies in front of sold homes, flashy dinners with clients, and just enough personal shots to make him look relatable. But there was one thing missing. Any mention of Lauren. No comments, no tagged photos, no traces of her in his online world. He was careful. Too careful. Still, I kept digging. It didn't take long to find a pattern. Every few weeks, Daniel posted pictures from a specific restaurant downtown, a fancy steakhouse that Lauren had always loved. I checked my bank account records and found exactly what I was looking for. Charges from that same steakhouse on nights she'd claimed to be working late. She hadn't even bothered to use a separate card. By the time Lauren left for work that day, my suspicions had hardened into certainty. I watched her pull out of the driveway, her car disappearing down the street, and felt a cold determination settle over me. I couldn't confront her yet, not without concrete proof. But that night, I'd have it. I spent the day preparing. I called the PI I'd hired and asked him to follow Lauren. He'd already been gathering evidence for me, photos, timestamps, locations, but tonight I needed him to go all in. Follow her, I told him. Wherever she goes, whoever she's with. I want to know everything. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, tracking her car in real time. The little blue moved predictably at first. Her office, a coffee shop, and then it veered into that same unfamiliar neighborhood. Daniel's neighborhood. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was what I needed. This was how I'd finally expose her. An hour later, she left the neighborhood and headed downtown. The tracker stopped at the steakhouse, confirming everything I already knew. My phone buzzed a few minutes later, a text from the PI. "They're here. Your wife and Daniel Harper, sitting together at a corner table. Intimate, but not too obvious." I clenched my jaw, my hands tightening into fists. Intimate, but not too obvious. Of course. She was always careful, wasn't she? Careful enough to keep me in the dark for months, maybe even years. As the evening dragged on, the PI sent me updates. Photos of them sitting close, her hand brushing his as they laughed over glasses of wine. A picture of them walking out together, his hand resting lightly on her lower back. Each image was like a dagger to my chest, twisting deeper with every notification. But I didn't stop him. I let him follow them, let him document every moment, because this wasn't just about catching her. This was about building my case, piece by piece, until there was no room for denial. At 11:30 p.m., the final text came through. They just arrived at his place. Lights on. Her car's in the driveway. I stared at the message, my mind racing. This was it, the proof I needed. I could have driven over there right then, stormed into his house, and confronted them both. But that wasn't my style. No, I had something much better in mind. I saved the photos, closing the laptop with a quiet finality. My hands no longer shook with anger. They were steady, deliberate. I didn't just want her to feel guilty. I wanted her to feel helpless, exposed, the way I had. That night, as Lauren slipped back into bed hours later, reeking of his cologne, I lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling. The plan was starting to take shape in my mind, and it was perfect. Unconventional, yes, but perfect. She had no idea what was coming. Lauren had no idea. None. She carried on as if her late nights and carefully crafted lies had gone unnoticed. The next morning, she kissed me on the cheek before leaving for work, her lips warm against my skin but cold in meaning. The same routine, the same empty affection. It was almost insulting how effortlessly she played the role of the doting wife. I watched her car pull out of the driveway, the little blue dot on my phone moving in sync with her. The tracker was flawless. Her every move laid bare, and she didn't even know. It was almost poetic, really. She thought she was the one with secrets, the one in control. But the real game was just beginning, and I held all the cards. That day, I took the next step in my plan. I called in sick to work again, telling my boss I had a stomach bug. Truthfully, my stomach did churn, but not from illness. It was the anticipation, the thrill of knowing what was coming. I spent the morning finalizing every detail, making sure there were no loose ends. Everything had to be perfect. The first order of business was gathering all the evidence into one place. The photos, the GPS logs, the receipts. I printed them out, each one more damning than the last, and arranged them in a neat folder. The sight of it made my chest tighten, not with sadness anymore, but with a cold, simmering rage. This was my proof, my weapon. Next, I made a phone call to Daniel's office. The receptionist answered with a cheery voice, completely unaware of the storm about to hit. I asked for him by name, using my calmest, most professional tone. He wasn't in, she said, but she could take a message. That's fine, I replied. Just let him know that Mark called. He'll know who I am. I hung up before she could ask any questions, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted him to squirm, to feel the same unease that had consumed me for weeks. He'd know who I was soon enough. When Lauren came home that evening, she was quieter than usual. I could tell something was off. Maybe Daniel had told her about the message. Maybe she'd sensed that the walls were closing in. Either way, she didn't say much during dinner, picking at her food while I watched her in silence. You seem distracted, I said finally, breaking the quiet. She looked up, startled, her fork frozen mid-air. Oh no, just tired. Work's been crazy. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. Of course. Work. The ultimate excuse. I didn't press her, though. Not yet. Let her think she was still safe. That night, I checked the tracker again, scrolling through her movements from the day. The steakhouse. His house. Back to work just in time to clock out. She was nothing if not careful, always covering her tracks. But it didn't matter anymore. I had everything I needed. As she slept beside me, her breathing soft and even, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The plan was almost complete. All the pieces were in place, and soon, the final move would come. She thought she could lie to me, betray me, and walk away unscathed. But by the time I was finished, she'd know exactly who she'd underestimated. The next day, I set the final wheels of my plan in motion. Lauren left early, her makeup flawless and her hair styled in a way she hadn't bothered with for me in years. I watched her pull out of the driveway, and as soon as her car disappeared from sight, I sprang into action. The folder of evidence sat on the kitchen counter, a silent reminder of her betrayal. I didn't need to add anything to it. It was airtight. But the folder wasn't my endgame. It was merely the bait. My real plan, the one Lauren wouldn't see coming, required a level of subtlety and precision she'd never expect from me. First, I paid a visit to Daniel. His office was easy to find, an upscale building downtown, all glass and polished steel. The receptionist smiled when I walked in, clearly not recognizing me. I gave her the same calm, professional tone I'd used on the phone. "I'm here to see Daniel Harper," I said. "It's urgent." She hesitated, glancing at her computer. "He's in a meeting, but I can." "No need," I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to leave no room for argument. "I'll wait." I didn't sit down. I stood near the window, arms crossed, watching as she nervously tapped at her keyboard. 15 minutes later, Daniel appeared, his face lighting up in that fake, practice smile he probably used to close deals. But when he saw me, the smile faltered. "Mark, right?" he said, extending a hand. I ignored it. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low but firm. The receptionist shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the tension. Daniel led me into a private conference room, closing the door behind us. He gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing, towering over him as he sank into a chair. "What's this about?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but I could see the unease in his eyes. I pulled out the folder and tossed it onto the table. It landed with a satisfying thud, the papers spilling slightly from the edges. He stared at it for a moment, then back at me. "Open it," I said. He hesitated, his fingers twitching as he reached for the folder. When he finally opened it, his face went pale. The photos, the GPS logs, the receipts, it was all there, staring back at him like a slap in the face. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "Care to explain?" I asked, my voice icy. He stammered something about not wanting to get involved, about how it wasn't serious, just a fling. I cut him off before he could finish. "You think I care about your excuses?" I leaned in, my hands braced on the table. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to end this. Today. You're going to cut her off, block her number, and never contact her again. And if you don't, well, let's just say I've got more than enough to ruin you." His face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. But then he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'll end it," he muttered. "Good," I said, straightening up, "because if you don't, this folder, it goes to your boss, your clients, and anyone else who might find it interesting. Understand?" He nodded again, his eyes avoiding mine. I left him there, deflated and broken, and walked out of the building with my head held high. One piece of the puzzle down. That night, Lauren came home earlier than usual, her smile brighter than it had been in weeks. For a moment, I wondered if Daniel had already told her, if she knew her little charade was falling apart. But if she did, she didn't show it. She kissed me on the cheek, humming as she made herself a drink. "You seem happy," I said, watching her carefully. She shrugged, sipping her wine. "Just glad to be home," she said with a smile. I smiled back, hiding the anger bubbling beneath the surface. Glad to be home, as if this house, this life we'd built together, still meant something to her. But it didn't matter, because soon, her happiness would crumble, just like mine had. And when it did, she'd finally understand what it felt like to lose everything. Lauren didn't suspect a thing. Not the way I watched her movements more closely, or the way I measured every word before I spoke. She carried on as if everything were normal, as if she wasn't living two lives and lying through her perfect, lipstick-covered smile. But I noticed the cracks starting to form. That Thursday evening, her phone buzzed on the counter while she was in the shower. Normally, she kept it glued to her hand, but she must have been distracted. The screen lit up with a message from a number that wasn't saved in her contacts. "I can't do this anymore. Don't call me. It's over." I stared at the message, my heart pounding in my chest. Daniel had followed through. Good. But the fact that she needed the text in the first place sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through me. I put the phone back where she'd left it, wiping away the smudges on the screen, and waited. When Lauren came back downstairs, towel drying her hair, she didn't even glance at her phone. She poured herself a glass of wine, sat on the couch, and started scrolling through the TV channels like nothing was wrong. It wasn't until 20 minutes later, when the screen lit up again with a follow-up message, "Please don't contact me anymore," that I saw her expression change. She picked up her phone, her smile faltering as she read the text. Her brows furrowed, and I could see the gears turning in her mind. She didn't say anything, just put the phone face down on the coffee table and stared blankly at the TV. The wine glass in her hand trembled slightly. "What's wrong?" I asked, keeping my voice light. She jumped, clearly startled. "Nothing," she said quickly, her tone too sharp, too defensive. "Just a long day at work." I nodded, not pushing further. I knew she wouldn't tell me the truth. Not now, not ever. But her discomfort was palpable, and I savored it. Let her squirm. Let her wonder. This was only the beginning. The next morning, Lauren left the house earlier than usual, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. I watched her from the window as she pulled out of the driveway, her shoulders tense, her movements jerky. She was unraveling, and it was a beautiful thing to see. I checked the GPS tracker as soon as she was out of sight. She drove straight to work, no detours, no secret stops. But something told me she wouldn't stay there all day. Not if she was trying to salvage whatever was left of her affair. Sure enough, by lunchtime, the tracker showed her heading back toward Daniel's neighborhood. She parked 2 blocks away, probably thinking she could be discreet. I laughed bitterly at her effort. She didn't know I was already 10 steps ahead. The PI I'd hired was waiting for her, stationed just down the street with a camera in hand. Within minutes, he sent me photos of her pacing on the sidewalk in front of Daniel's house, her phone pressed to her ear. She looked frantic, desperate. But Daniel never came to the door. I watched as the tracker pinged her car back to the office later that afternoon. She probably thought she'd gotten away with it, that no one had seen her. But the photos told a different story. She was losing control, and she knew it. When she came home that evening, I could see the strain in her face. Her eyes were red, her smile forced. I kissed her on the cheek, playing the dutiful husband, and asked her about her day. "Same as always," she said, her voice flat. "Just work, work, work." I smiled, hiding the storm brewing inside me. "Same as always," I repeated. I wanted to laugh at the irony. Nothing about this was the same. Not anymore. That night, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, I opened the folder of evidence on my laptop and added the new photos. The timeline was complete. Every lie, every betrayal, laid out in perfect detail. She thought she could lie to me, manipulate me, and come out unscathed. But she was about to learn the truth. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice, and I was finally ready to deliver it. By Saturday morning, Lauren was on edge, a shadow of the confident woman she used to be. She moved around the house like a ghost, her phone glued to her hand, her eyes darting to me when she thought I wasn't looking. She didn't bring up the texts, didn't mention Daniel, but her silence was louder than any confession. I could see it all over her face, the regret, the confusion, the panic. She was losing him, the one thing she had clung to outside our marriage, and she didn't know how to hide it. But what she didn't realize was that she wasn't just losing him. She was losing everything. That morning, I took my time getting ready, deliberately lingering over my coffee while she paced the kitchen. I told her I had some errands to run, then casually asked about her plans for the day. Her answer was a jumble of half-formed words and vague excuses. She said she might run out for a bit, grab some groceries, maybe meet a friend. It was the kind of non-committal response she'd perfected over the last few months. I smiled, keeping my tone light. "Sounds good. Have fun." She watched me leave, her brow furrowed like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I didn't give her the chance. I walked out the door, got in my car, and drove a few blocks away before parking and pulling out my phone. The tracker showed her still at home, but I knew it wouldn't be long before she made her move. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, the little blue that started to move. I followed it from a safe distance, my heart pounding in my chest. She didn't head to the grocery store or to meet a friend. She went straight to Daniel's neighborhood, parking a block away again like she thought that made her clever. I stayed in my car, watching from a distance as she walked up to his house. She knocked once, twice, and when no one answered, she pulled out her phone. A few minutes later, she was pacing again, her free hand running through her hair as she tried to call him. It was almost sad to watch, almost. I took photos from where I sat, zooming in on her frantic movements, her desperate expression. She looked unhinged, a woman teetering on the edge. I wondered what was running through her mind. Did she think he was ignoring her? Did she suspect that I knew? Either way, It didn't matter. She was unraveling, and it was all falling into place. After 20 minutes of waiting with no response, she gave up. I watched her stomp back to her car. Her shoulders slumped, her face twisted in frustration. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at her phone, probably debating whether to text him again. But she didn't. Eventually, she started the car and drove off, heading back toward home. I let her get a good head start before following. My mind was buzzing with anticipation. I was so close now, so close to finally pulling the trigger on my plan. Every piece was in place. Every lie she'd told, every betrayal, was documented and ready to be unleashed. By the time I got home, she was already in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine. She didn't look at me when I walked in, and for a moment, I wondered if she knew. But no. If she suspected anything, she would have said something. Instead, she mumbled something about how her errands had taken longer than expected, her voice tight and distracted. I nodded, pretending to listen. Inside, I was smiling. She thought she'd covered her tracks, thought she still had the upper hand. But she didn't know what I had planned. She didn't know that by the end of the weekend, her entire world would come crashing down. Sunday arrived with an unsettling calm. The kind of calm you feel before the first crack of thunder when the air is too still, too quiet. Lauren woke up late, slipping downstairs in her robe like nothing was wrong. She poured her coffee and sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone as if she didn't have a care in the world. I watched her from across the room, sipping my own coffee, pretending to read the news. Every time her phone buzzed, she flinched, her eyes darting to the screen. She was waiting for something for him, I guessed, but I already knew Daniel wouldn't respond. I made sure of that. Mid-morning, I told her I needed to run some errands. Just a quick trip, I said, nothing special. She barely looked up from her phone, just waved me off with a distracted smile. It was almost laughable how little attention she was paying to me. She didn't realize that every step I took, every word I said, was part of something much bigger. I drove into town and parked near the coffee shop where Daniel liked to spend his Sunday mornings. Sure enough, there he was sitting in the corner by the window, his laptop open in front of him. He looked calm, collected, like a man who thought he'd escaped unscathed. I walked inside, my heart pounding but my expression calm. He didn't notice me until I was standing right in front of him. When he looked up, his eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing his face. "We need to talk," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. He glanced around, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't think that's a good idea," he muttered. "Oh, I think it is," I said, pulling out the folder I'd brought with me. I dropped it on the table, the paper spilling out just enough to give him a glimpse of what was inside. His face paled. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I leaned in, my eyes locked on his. "I want you to listen carefully, because this is the last time I'm going to say it. You're done. With her, with this. You don't contact her, you don't see her, you don't so much as think about her. Got it?" He nodded quickly, his hands trembling as he closed his laptop. "I'm done. I swear." "Good," I said, straightening up. "Because if you're not, this folder? It goes public. And believe me, Daniel, you don't want that." I left without waiting for a response, my footsteps steady and deliberate as I walked out of the coffee shop. The adrenaline buzzed in my veins, but I kept my composure. This wasn't about him. Not really. He was just a pawn in a much larger game. When I got home, Lauren was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book. She looked up as I walked in, her expression neutral, but I could see the tension in her posture. She was waiting for me to slip, to say or do something that would give me away. But I didn't. I dropped my keys on the counter, poured myself a drink, and sat down across from her. "How's the book?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She shrugged. "It's fine. Nothing special." I nodded, sipping my drink, the calm before the storm. She had no idea what was coming. That night, as she slept beside me, I finalized the last steps of my plan. The evidence was ready. The timing was perfect. Tomorrow, everything would change. Monday morning came like any other day. Lauren moved through the house with her usual routine, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. But I could see it in her eyes, the unease, the cracks beneath the surface. She was unraveling, and she didn't even know how close she was to the edge. I stayed home from work that day, using the excuse of a client call to set up shop in the home office. Lauren didn't question it. She left for work with a distracted kiss on my cheek, and I watched her drive away, the GPS tracker already pinging her every move. By mid-morning, she was exactly where I expected her to be, Daniel's neighborhood. The tracker showed her circling his house twice before finally parking a block away. I imagined her standing there on the sidewalk, her phone pressed to her ear, trying to reach him. But Daniel wouldn't answer. Not today. While she spiraled, I got to work. The folder of evidence sat on my desk, a silent testament to everything she thought she could hide. I scanned the documents, uploading the photos and texts to a cloud drive. Then I drafted an email, carefully composing the words that would shatter her carefully constructed life. I sent the email to everyone who mattered in her world. Her boss, her co-workers, her closest friends, even her parents. Each recipient received the same message. This is who Lauren really is. Attached were the photos, the receipts, and the timestamps. Every lie, every betrayal, laid out in excruciating detail. I hit send at exactly 12:15 p.m. By the time Lauren came home that evening, the storm had already begun. When she walked through the door, I was sitting in the living room, waiting for her. She looked tired, defeated, but she tried to smile anyway. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice forced. I didn't answer. Instead, I slid the folder across the coffee table toward her. She froze, her eyes darting to the folder, then back to me. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Open it," I said. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the edge of the folder. When she finally opened it, her face went white. The photos, the text, the GPS logs, it was all there. She stared at it in silence, her breathing shallow, her hands shaking. I waited, letting the weight of the evidence sink in. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were wide with panic. "Mark, I can explain," she stammered. "Explain?" I leaned back in my chair, my voice calm. "Go ahead, Lauren. Explain. Tell me how this isn't exactly what it looks like." She started to cry, the tears streaming down her face as she tried to piece together some kind of excuse. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said. "It was a mistake. A stupid mistake." "A mistake?" I laughed, the sound bitter and cold. "Mistakes don't last for months, Lauren. Mistakes don't involve secret meetings and late-night texts. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. Over and over again, you chose him." She sobbed harder, her face buried in her hands. "I didn't want to hurt you," she whispered. "I love you, Mark. I swear y do." "Love?" I stood up, towering over her. "You don't even know what that word means. If you loved me, you wouldn't have lied to me. You wouldn't have betrayed me. You don't love me, Lauren. You love yourself." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. "I'll do anything. Just tell me how to fix this." "You can," I said, my voice flat. "It's too late." I walked away, leaving her sobbing on the couch. Upstairs, I grabbed a bag I'd packed earlier that day and headed for the door. She called after me, her voice desperate, but I didn't look back. As I drove away, my phone buzzed with notifications. The fallout from the email was already starting. Friends, co-workers, family, they were all responding, their messages a mix of shock and disgust. Lauren's world was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. And me? I felt nothing but satisfaction. She thought she could betray me, lie to me, and walk away unscathed. But now, she was finally paying the price. I didn't go far after I left. I wasn't running, and I wasn't hiding. This wasn't about escape. It was about watching the dominoes fall. I parked my car at the edge of a park a few miles from home, the kind of place we used to take weekend walks before Lauren's work commitments became more important than us. My phone buzzed nonstop with incoming messages, but I didn't answer any of them. This was Lauren's mess now. I'd done my part. The first message came from one of her co-workers. It was blunt. "Did you know?" The second was from her best friend. "Call me, please. This can't be real." I didn't respond to either. Instead, I scrolled through the group email thread where her world was unraveling in real time. The email I sent had gone viral among her circle, forwarded to people I hadn't even considered. Lauren's co-workers were the first to chime in, disbelief, judgment, thinly veiled mockery. Then came her boss. His response was icy and professional. "Lauren, we need to have a conversation about this tomorrow morning. Please plan to meet me in my office at 9 a.m. Her parents, though, delivered the cruelest blow. The response from her mother hit me like a sledgehammer. "We raised you better than this. I can't believe you'd throw away everything for someone like him. Don't expect us to take your side in this. We're disappointed, to say the least." By the time I got home that night, Lauren's car was gone. The house was dark and silent, except for the faint smell of wine lingering in the air. She'd left in a hurry, it seemed, probably running to whatever friend would still take her in. If she thought she could hide from this, she was mistaken. The truth was everywhere now, and there was no coming back from it. I walked through the house, room by room, taking in the life we'd built together. The family photos on the walls, the coffee mugs we'd bought on vacations, the little trinkets she used to insist on picking up wherever we went. It should have felt like a loss, but it didn't. It felt like freedom. As I stood in the kitchen, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Daniel. I almost ignored it, but something in me wanted to hear what he had to say. I answered, my voice cold and steady. "Mark," he began, his voice shaky. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't know it would come to this." "You didn't know?" I laughed bitterly. "You knew exactly what you were doing, Daniel. You just didn't think you'd get caught." He stammered something about being blindsided, about Lauren being the one who pursued him. But I didn't care. None of it mattered now. I cut him off before he could finish. "It's over, Daniel. For both of you. Don't call me again." I hung up, tossing my phone onto the counter. The anger that had sustained me for weeks was gone now, replaced by a strange sense of calm. Lauren had always been the type to blame everyone but herself, but this time, there was no one left to blame. She'd built this house of cards, and I'd just given it the slightest nudge. The final twist came the next morning. I was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee when a car pulled up to the curb. It wasn't Lauren. It was her mother. She got out, her face set in a grim expression, and walked up the steps without a word. We sat in silence for a moment before she finally spoke. "I'm not here to make excuses for her, Mark. She betrayed you, and she betrayed our family. But I need to ask, what are you going to do about the kids?" The kids. It was the first time I'd allowed myself to think about the fallout beyond Lauren. The thought of seeing her again, even to discuss custody, made my stomach turn, but her mother was right. They deserved better than this. "I'll do whatever's best for them," I said finally, my voice quiet. "But Lauren's not coming back here. Not ever." Her mother nodded, her expression unreadable. "I hope you mean that," she said, standing to leave. "Because if you let her back in after all of this, she'll only do it again." I watched her walk away, the weight of her words settling over me like a stone. She was right. I knew she was right. But even as the anger faded, replaced by exhaustion and a deep, aching sadness, I couldn't bring myself to regret what I'd done. Lauren thought she could betray me, lie to me, and walk away unscathed. But now, her lies were exposed, her world shattered. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe. What do you guys think of my story? Share in the comments what you think about the choice I made, and would you do in my situation?